The Catwoman who always waited for me at the bus stop. Desmond checked his wrist link for the third time in 2 minutes. The 0715 hoverbus to the Vesperus Prime orbital elevators was running late, delayed by the heavy condensation that clung to the magnetic rails. Rain on this planet did not fall in droplets. It was a thick, silver mist that turned the neon advertisements of the lower transit districts into blurred smears of violet and gold. He adjusted the collar of his charcoal gray overcoat, feeling the dampness begin to seep through the reinforced fabric. He was a man of routines, a logistics manager who found a quiet sort of peace in the predictable flow of cargo and schedules. Isadora was already there. She sat at the far end of the translucent transit shelter, tucked away in the corner where the wind didn't bite quite as hard. She was a Felis sapiens, her sleek black fur dampened by the spray of the morning. She wore an oversized gray hoodie that seemed to swallow her slim frame, the hood pulled low to hide her ears. Only her tail, a thin black whip that flicked rhythmically against the metal slats of the bench, betrayed her presence to anyone not looking for her. Desmond shifted his briefcase to his left hand. He had seen her every morning for the last week, always in the same spot, always looking like she was trying to vanish into the architecture. He looked at the way she shivered. The cold on Vesperus Prime was a biting, humid thing that got under the skin, or in her case, through the fur. A heavy gust of wind sent a sheet of rain sweeping under the shelter. It splashed against her boots and soaked the hem of her oversized sweater. She didn't move, but her shoulders hunched closer to her ears. Desmond looked at his umbrella, a sturdy, carbon fiber model meant for the high-pressure weather of the industrial zones. He took 3 measured steps toward her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space. "The wind is picking up," Desmond said. His voice was steady, a low baritone that carried over the sound of the mist hitting the pavement. She didn't look up at first. Her ears twitched beneath the fabric of her hood and her tail went still. "I hadn't noticed," she whispered. Her voice was like velvet rubbing against silk, melodic and surprisingly soft. Desmond moved another step closer, extending the reach of the umbrella so it created a dry dome over her corner of the bench. "You are shivering," he noted. "I am not trying to intrude on your space, but the shelter has a leak directly above your shoulder. You will be soaked before the bus arrives." Isadora finally looked up. Her eyes were a striking, luminous green, reflecting the scrolling stock tickers from the skyscraper across the street. She looked at the umbrella, then at Desmond. She seemed to be searching for something in his face, perhaps the usual condescension or the wary distance most humans kept from her kind in this sector. She found neither. "Thank you," she said, her voice a fraction louder. Desmond nodded and sat at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining a respectful gap while keeping the umbrella positioned over both of them. "My name is Desmond. I manage the cargo flow at the central elevators." "I am Isadora," she replied. She reached up with a furred hand to pull her hood back just an inch, revealing the sharp, elegant points of her ears. "I work in the data archives 3 blocks from the station." Mallory, the Avian Street vendor who kept a stall adjacent to the transit stop, squawked a greeting as she flipped a tray of synthetic protein bars. She watched the two of them with sharp, golden eyes, her colorful feathers ruffled against the damp. "Take the man's shade, Isadora," Mallory called out, her voice a raspy chirp. "Desmond is the only one in this district who does not have his nose buried in a datapad. He actually notices when the sky is falling." Desmond offered a small, polite smile to the vendor. "I just prefer to know where I am going, Mallory." Isadora shifted slightly, leaning a few inches toward the center of the bench, closer to the warmth Desmond radiated. "It is rare for someone to offer anything here without a credit chip exchange," she said. "Most people look through me as if I am part of the station's shadow." Desmond looked out at the gray horizon where the massive cables of the orbital elevators disappeared into the clouds. "Logistics teaches you that every component matters," he said. "If one part is out in the cold, the whole system feels the friction. It is a matter of efficiency, and perhaps common decency. Isadora let out a small, soft sound that might have been a purr or a sigh of relief. I have been in the city for 6 months. I am still trying to adjust to the friction. The air between them felt a little less heavy. Desmond found himself focusing on the rhythm of her breathing rather than the delay on his wrist link. He had spent years managing the movements of millions of tons of steel and fuel, yet this small, quiet interaction felt more significant than a successful launch schedule. "You should wear a heavier coat," Desmond suggested, his tone helpful rather than critical. "The archives are notoriously drafty. My department handles the climate units for that sector. I know how they struggle in the rain." Isadora looked at him with a glimmer of amusement in her green eyes. "Are you offering to fix the archives, or just my wardrobe, Desmond?" "Perhaps both, if the opportunity arises," he replied. The low drone of the hoverbus finally echoed through the street. The heavy vehicle glided toward the curb, its lights cutting through the silver mist. As the doors hissed open, the usual crowd of commuters began to shove forward, their faces grim and focused on their own destinations. Desmond stood up first, but he didn't move toward the door. He held the umbrella steady, waiting for Isadora to rise. She stood slowly, smoothing down her hoodie. For a moment, she stood very close to him, and he caught the faint scent of dried herbs and rain-dampened fur. "After you," Desmond said, gesturing toward the bus. Isadora stepped out from under the umbrella and into the bus's doorway. She stopped and turned back, her green eyes bright. "Will you be here tomorrow, Desmond?" Desmond closed the umbrella, the mechanism clicking shut with a finality that felt like a promise. "I am never late for the 0715, he said. She smiled then, a quick, genuine expression that transformed her face. "Then I suppose I will not have to wait alone." She disappeared into the crowded interior of the bus. Desmond followed, finding a spot near the back where he could see the back of her hooded head. The rain continued to smear the windows of Vesperis Prime, but as the bus pulled away from the station, the gray morning didn't seem quite so cold. He realized he was no longer checking his wrist link. For the first time in years, the schedule didn't matter as much as the person waiting at the end of the line. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the bus's heater, a sense of connection that had been sparked by a simple umbrella and a shared silence. The city moved on, indifferent to them, but on that damp bench, a quiet alliance had been formed. The morning air on Vesperis Prime felt like a cold, wet blanket, but the routine provided Desmond with his usual sense of armor. He arrived at the transit station 10 minutes before the 0715 hoverbus was due. Instead of standing in his customary spot near the edge of the platform, he walked toward the small kiosk tucked under the rusted overhang of the terminal. Mallory looked up as he approached. The avian vendor adjusted her translation collar, her iridescent purple feathers ruffling against the chill. She reached for a single container of nutrient broth before Desmond could speak, but he held up 2 fingers. "To today, Mallory," he said, placing his credit chip on the counter. Mallory paused, her dark, beady eyes darting toward the bench where Isadora usually sat. "You have a guest, Desmond. That is a change for you. Usually, you are as predictable as the tide." "I am simply being hospitable," Desmond replied. Mallory clicked her beak, a sound of amusement. "Hospitality is a rare currency in this city. Just make sure you do not spend it all in one place." He took the 2 steaming cups, the heat seeping through the insulated sleeves and warming his palms. When he turned back to the platform, Isadora was already there. She wore the same oversized gray hoodie, but she had pulled the drawstring tight, leaving only her green eyes and the bridge of her nose visible. She looked small against the backdrop of the towering industrial spires that clawed at the overcast sky. Desmond walked over and held out one of the cups. "Good morning, Isadora." She jumped slightly, her ears twitching beneath the fabric of her hood. She looked at the cup and then up at him, her expression a mix of caution and wonder. "For me." It is cold and the bus is delayed by another 4 minutes, Desmond said, sitting on the far end of the bench to give her space. It is standard nutrient broth. High protein, low sodium. Isadora reached out, her fingers covered in fine black fur. She took the cup with a delicate touch, her claws retracting completely. Thank you, Desmond. You are very kind. Most people here do not look at us, let alone offer a warm drink. We are all just trying to get through the shift, he said. They sat in silence for a moment, the steam from their cups mingling with the mist. Desmond felt a strange contentment. The rigid schedule of his life had always been a cage, but today the bars felt a little wider. What do you do in the archives? He asked, breaking the quiet. I categorize data from the old expansion era, she said, her voice muffled by the hood. Most of it is boring. Lists of minerals, shipping manifests, and terraforming logs. But sometimes I find stories. Letters from people who lived on worlds that do not exist anymore. It makes the city feel less like a machine. Desmond nodded. I work with the orbital elevators. I make sure the crates get from the ground to the ships without hitting each other. It is all numbers and trajectories. Numbers are just stories that have been simplified, she whispered. The hoverbus hissed to a halt in front of them, the doors sliding open with a mechanical groan. They boarded together, finding seats across from one another. For the duration of the ride, they spoke of small things, the price of synthetic fruit, and the way the lights of the city looked from the upper decks of the transport. When they reached the central hub, Isadora stood up, her tail giving a small, graceful flick of goodbye. I will see you tomorrow, Desmond, she asked. Count on it, he said. Desmond arrived at the logistics headquarters feeling lighter than he had in years. He navigated the sea of gray-suited executives and automated drones with a new sense of vigor. However, the mood shifted the moment he entered the main control room. Gideon was waiting for him. His supervisor was a man of sharp angles and even sharper instincts. He stood before a holographic display of the planet's shipping lanes, his arms crossed over his chest. You were late to the briefing by 3 minutes, Desmond, Gideon said, his voice level but firm. The transit lines are experiencing delays due to the weather, Desmond replied, stepping toward his console. Gideon turned, his eyes narrowing. I am not talking about the bus. I am talking about your focus. Word travels fast in the transit sector. People are talking about a logistics manager who has taken an interest in a Feli Sapiens. I did not realize my morning commute was a matter of corporate policy, Desmond said, his voice hardening. It is a matter of optics, Gideon countered. The board is pushing for a purity initiative. They want to phase out non-human labor in the archives and the docks. It is cheaper to use droids and it keeps the population compliant. If you are seen fraternizing with them, it puts a target on your back. I am telling you this as a friend, Desmond. Stay in your lane. Desmond sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the interface. I have spent my whole life in my lane, Gideon. It is a very lonely road. Gideon sighed, the tension in his shoulders dropping slightly. Just be careful. The city is changing and not for the better. The warning stayed with Desmond throughout the day. He processed thousands of tons of cargo, his mind a whirlwind of coordinates and weight limits, but he couldn't shake the image of Isadora shivering on the bench. When his shift finally ended, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. He hurried back to the transit station, his umbrella gripped tightly in his hand. He hoped to see her, to ensure she had made it through her day unscathed. As he rounded the corner to the platform, his heart hammered against his ribs. Isadora was there, but she wasn't alone. 3 transit officers in reinforced tactical gear had surrounded the bench. One of them, a man with a scarred jaw and a sneer, was holding Isadora's identification chip just out of her reach. I told you, Stray, the officer said, his voice echoing under the metal roof. This sector is for essential personnel only. Your permit for the archives does not give you the right to loiter. "I am waiting for my transport," Isadora said, her voice trembling but clear. "I have every right to be here." The officer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Rights are for citizens. You are a guest of the corporation. Maybe you need a night in the holding cells to remind you of your place." He reached out to grab her arm, his heavy gloved hand closing around her sleeve. Isadora pulled back, her ears flattening against her head, a low growl beginning to form in her throat. Desmond didn't think. He didn't calculate trajectories or consider the optics. He stepped into the circle, the tip of his umbrella clicking sharply against the wet pavement. "That is enough," Desmond said, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who commanded the planet's supply lines. The officers turned, surprised by the intrusion. The lead officer narrowed his eyes. "This is official business, citizen. Move along." Desmond stepped closer, standing between the officer and Isadora. "My name is Desmond Vance, Senior Logistics Manager for the Orbital Hub. This woman is with me. She is a recognized employee of the archives, and her transit permit is valid. If you have a problem with her presence here, you can take it up with my department's legal counsel." The officer looked at Desmond's high-clearance badge, then back at his companions. He tossed the identification chip onto the wet bench. "You are making a mistake, Vance," the officer spat. "You shouldn't be sticking your neck out for a rug." The officers turned and marched away, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of damp earth and tension. Desmond turned to Isadora. She was shaking, her hands tucked deep into her sleeves. He picked up her identification chip and wiped the water from it before handing it back. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She took the chip, her fingers brushing against his. "You shouldn't have done that. They will remember your face. They will make things difficult for you." Desmond looked out at the rainy city, the neon signs blurring in the mist. "Let them. I am tired of watching the world from behind a glass wall." Isadora stepped closer, her shoulder leaning against his arm. The warmth of her presence was a stark contrast to the cold wind. "Thank you, Desmond. No one has ever stood up for me like that." He opened the umbrella, the wide canopy shielding them both from the storm. "We should get on the bus," he said. "It is a long way home." As they sat together on the dark transport, the city lights flickering past the windows, Desmond realized that Gideon was right. The city was changing. But as Isadora rested her head briefly against his shoulder, a soft, purring vibration that he felt in his very bones, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. They were two different species, from two different worlds, but in the heart of the storm, they had found a common ground that the corporation could never understand. The alliance was no longer just a shared umbrella. It was a promise. The rain on Vesperus Prime did not fall so much as it drifted, a heavy curtain of moisture that clung to the skin and turned the neon signs of the transit district into smeared jewels. Desmond stood at the usual spot, his hand gripping the handle of his umbrella with a white-knuckled intensity. He checked his watch. The hoverbus was 4 minutes late, which was common, but Isadora was 6 minutes late. That was impossible. She lived by the rhythm of the city just as he did, her survival depending on the invisibility of her punctuality. When she finally emerged from the fog, she wasn't walking with her usual graceful, silent stride. She was stumbling. Her oversized hoodie was torn at the shoulder, and as she stepped into the light of the transit shelter, Desmond felt a cold surge of adrenaline. A dark, purplish bruise marred the delicate fur of her forearm, and her green eyes were wide, the pupils blown wide with terror. "Isadora," he said, stepping forward and ignoring the social distance usually maintained in public. "What happened?" She didn't speak at first. She simply leaned into him, her small frame shaking so violently that he could feel it through the heavy fabric of his overcoat. He moved the umbrella to shield her from the wind, creating a small, private world beneath the canopy. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged data drive. The casing was cracked, as if it had been ripped out of a terminal in a hurry. They are moving the archives, she whispered, her voice cracking. It is not just a reorganization, Desmond. I saw the manifests. They are reclassifying all non-human residents as industrial assets. Desmond felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Industrial assets. That is a term for equipment, Isadora, not people. She looked up at him, her ears pinned back against her head. They are sending us to Oros 4. It is a high-gravity mining colony. They need bodies that can withstand the pressure, and they do not care if those bodies are broken by the end of the first year. Your company, Ethelgard Logistics, signed the transport contracts this morning. The realization hit Desmond like a physical blow. He was the senior manager for off-world shipping. He had seen a surge in heavy-duty transport requests for Oros 4 on his terminal yesterday, but the cargo had been listed under a generic biological waste code. He had authorized the fuel rods and the navigation paths without a second thought. He had been the one to clear the way for her disappearance. I didn't know, he said, the words feeling hollow and useless in his mouth. I know you didn't, she said, clutching the drive to her chest, but they saw me. A security team caught me downloading the encryption keys. I managed to get into the vents, but they are hunting me now. They have my biometric signature. I cannot go back to my HAB unit. A black sedan with tinted windows and no license plates rounded the corner, slowing as it approached the transit stop. It didn't look like a police vehicle. It looked like the predatory, unmarked cars used by the corporate internal security teams. The sensors on its roof rotated slowly, scanning the faces of the few workers huddled under the shelters. "Give me the drive," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. Isadora pulled back, her eyes flashing with a brief moment of doubt. "No, I cannot put this on you. If they find it in your possession, they will treat you as a traitor." Desmond reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers closing over the drive. "I am a senior logistics manager. My briefcase is shielded against standard scanners and I have high-level clearance. They won't search me without a direct order from the board of directors. You need to get out of the city center. Go to the docks. Find Mallory. She knows the back alleys better than anyone." The black car came to a complete stop 20 yards away. The doors didn't open yet, but the engine remained engaged, a low vibration that shook the puddles on the pavement. "Desmond," she said, her voice a soft, desperate plea. "Go," he urged her. "I will find a way to verify this. If what you say is true, I will make sure this data reaches the right people. I promise you, Isadora, I will not let them ship you away like freight." She squeezed his hand once, a brief, warm pressure that lingered even after she stepped back into the shadows. She moved with a sudden, feline speed, disappearing into the narrow gap between two industrial warehouses just as the car doors began to hiss open. Desmond didn't look toward the car. He turned his back, opened his briefcase, and slotted the data drive into a hidden compartment designed for emergency backup keys. He snapped the latches shut and stood tall, adjusting his tie as the hoverbus finally groaned to a halt at the curb. He boarded the transport with the practiced ease of a man who had nothing to hide, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. The office at Ethelgard Logistics was a cathedral of glass and steel, overlooking the sprawling shipyards. Desmond walked through the main lobby, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone. He felt the weight of the drive in his hand, a tiny object that could bring the entire glass tower crashing down. He went straight to his terminal, but before he could even log in, a shadow fell across his desk. "Desmond, we need to talk," Gideon said. His supervisor looked tired. The usual sharp lines of his suit were slightly rumpled, and he wasn't carrying his tablet. He gestured toward the private briefing room at the end of the hall. Desmond followed him, his mind racing through every possible excuse. He wondered if the security team had already linked him to Isadora at the bus stop. Gideon closed the door and engaged the privacy screen. The windows frosted over, cutting off the view of the city. "The board is moving fast," Gideon said, leaning against the table. They think they can bypass the Planetary Council by using the New Purity Initiative as a legal smokescreen. They are clearing out the archives, the docks, the service sectors. Anyone without a human standard genetic profile is being processed for Oros 4. Desmond kept his expression neutral. I saw the shipping manifests, Gideon. I assumed it was a standard labor contract. Gideon let out a short, bitter laugh. You are a better liar than that. I saw you at the transit station this morning on the security feed. I saw the girl. I also saw you take something from her. The silence in the room became heavy. Desmond didn't move. He weighed his options, calculating the risk of trust. Gideon had been his mentor for a decade, but the corporation demanded absolute loyalty. What are you going to do? Desmond asked, his voice steady. Are you going to call security? Gideon sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, encrypted communicator. I have been looking for a way to stop this for 6 months, but I am a marked man, Desmond. Every file I touch is flagged. Every person I talk to is watched. But you are the golden boy of logistics. You have the access codes to the orbital relays that they haven't bothered to change in years. Desmond looked at the communicator, then at the man he thought he knew. You want me to leak the data? I want you to do more than leak it, Gideon said, his eyes burning with a sudden fierce intensity. I want you to redirect the ships. If those transports launch with the wrong coordinates, they will land in the neutral territories of the Outer Rim. Once they are there, the corporation loses all legal jurisdiction. But I can't do it alone. I need the encryption keys from the archives. Desmond reached into his briefcase and pulled out the cracked drive. I think I already have them. Gideon stared at the drive, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Then we have a chance. But you realize what this means, don't you? If we do this, there is no going back. We will be fugitives before the sun sets. Desmond thought of Isadora, shivering in the rain, and the way she had looked at him with hope instead of fear. He thought of the 20 years he had spent moving boxes and balancing spreadsheets while the world grew colder around him. I have spent my whole life following the schedule, Gideon, Desmond said, his voice firm and certain. I think it is about time I caused a delay. Good, Gideon said, stepping toward the terminal. Because the first transport is scheduled to depart in 4 hours. We have work to do. Desmond ran through the downpour, his boots splashing into puddles that reflected the flickering neon advertisements of Vesperus Prime. He reached the transit station panting, his lungs burning with the sharp, metallic air of the industrial district. The bench was empty. The spot where Isadora usually sat, tucked away from the wind with her hood pulled low, was occupied only by a discarded food wrapper tumbling in the breeze. There was no sign of her. No lingering scent of the spice tea she favored, no footprints in the grime. He turned toward Mallory's stall. The avian vendor was usually the first to offer a sharp-witted comment or a sales pitch, but today she was frantically pulling a heavy shutter over her display of synthetic grains. Her feathers were puffed out, a clear sign of distress in her species. Mallory, Desmond shouted over the roar of a passing cargo hauler. Where is she? The vendor froze, her large, dark eyes darting toward the shadows of the nearby alleyways. You need to leave, logistics man. You are bad luck today. Everyone is bad luck today. Desmond stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. Mallory, look at me. Isadora, where did they take her? Mallory's beak clicked nervously. A black transport. No corporate decals, but the armor plating was high grade. They didn't even wait for the bus to clear the lane. 2 men in tactical gear grabbed her. She fought, Desmond. She fought well, but they had stun prods. They threw her in the back like a crate of defective parts. Desmond felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the rain. Which way? The iron cradle, Mallory whispered, her voice barely audible. Sector 4. The private berths. They don't report to Central Transit Control there. If you go there, you won't come back. Desmond didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and sprinted back toward the alley where Gideon sat idling in a nondescript gray hover sedan. He wrenched the door open and climbed in, his clothes dripping onto the leather upholstery. "She is at the iron cradle," Desmond said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Sector 4. Gideon swore under his breath, shifting the vehicle into drive. "That is the black site for the board's private security. If they have her there, they aren't looking to deport her. They are looking to erase the evidence, and she is the last witness." "Can you get us in?" Desmond asked, staring at the blurred lights of the city as they accelerated. Gideon tapped a sequence into the dash console, bringing up a wireframe map of the docks. "I can get us past the perimeter fence using my supervisor override, but once we are inside the facility, we are on our own. The internal sensors are on a closed loop." Desmond leaned forward, his eyes scanning the logistics data flickering on the screen. He saw the flow of shipping containers, the automated cranes, and the scheduled departures. His mind, trained by decades of managing the city's pulse, began to see the patterns. There, Desmond pointed to a cluster of red icons near the water's edge. "That is the loading bay for the high-priority freighters. If they are moving her off-planet, that is where they will do it. But look at the power draw. They are running a heavy interrogation suite in the subbasement of Warehouse 12. "How do you know that?" Gideon asked, weaving through the thick traffic of the industrial zone. "Because that warehouse is listed as a cold storage unit for perishables," Desmond explained, his thoughts racing. "But it is pulling 3 times the wattage required for refrigeration. They are running computers, lights, and security baffles. They think they are being discreet by hiding the signature in a high-traffic zone, but the numbers don't lie." Gideon glanced at him with a newfound respect. 20 years of counting boxes actually paid off. They reached the perimeter of the iron cradle 10 minutes later. The facility was a sprawling labyrinth of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete, looming over the dark waters of the harbor like a sleeping beast. Gideon pulled the car into a darkened nook behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. "We walk from here," Gideon said, reaching into the glove box and pulling out 2 compact pulse pistols. He handed one to Desmond. "Do you know how to use this?" Desmond took the weapon, feeling its unfamiliar weight in his hand. "Point and pull the trigger." "Try not to shoot me," Gideon remarked dryly. "We need a diversion. If we just walk in, the automated turrets will turn us into Swiss cheese." Desmond looked up at the massive automated crane towering over Warehouse 12. He remembered the maintenance schedules he had approved just last week. The crane's logic core was overdue for a firmware patch. It was a minor glitch he had flagged for later, but now it was a weapon. "Give me your data pad," Desmond said. "I can tap into the local meshnet. If I can trigger a safety override on that crane, it will drop its load." Gideon handed over the device. "What good does a dropped crate do?" "It creates a level 5 industrial accident," Desmond said, his fingers flying across the screen. "Protocol dictates that all non-essential security personnel must assist in containment, and that the automated turrets must enter a standby mode to prevent accidental targeting of emergency responders. It is a hard-coded safety feature. They can't override it from the warehouse." Gideon grinned. "I take it back. You aren't just a logistics manager, you are a saboteur." Desmond didn't smile. He was thinking of Isadora's green eyes and the way her tail flicked when she was happy. He was thinking of the bruises Mallory had mentioned. He found the command line for the crane and entered the sequence. A massive shipping container, filled with heavy machinery parts, began to rise slowly into the air. It reached its apex directly above the main access road. Desmond held his breath and swiped his thumb across the screen. The magnetic clamps released with a thunderous metallic clang that echoed across the docks. The container plummeted, smashing into the concrete with a bone-shaking impact that sent sparks and debris flying in every direction. High-pitched sirens immediately began to wail, and the red glow of the perimeter turrets faded to a dull, standby amber. "Now," Desmond said. They moved quickly, staying low as security teams in black uniforms rushed toward the site of the crash. Desmond led the way, navigating through the maze of crates with the precision of a man who knew every inch of the city's layout. They reached the side entrance of Warehouse 12 just as a squad of guards exited the front. Gideon used a bypass key on the door's electronic lock. The light turned green and they slipped inside. The air was frigid, smelling of ozone and old grease. They moved through rows of silent, refrigerated shelves until they reached a heavy steel door leading to the sub-basement. Desmond could hear voices through the metal. They were cold, clinical, and devoid of any empathy. "She is stubborn for a stray," a man's voice said. "Give her another jolt. We need the location of the backup drive before the morning transport leaves." Desmond didn't wait for Gideon to give a signal. He kicked the door open, his pulse pistol raised. The room was small, lit by a single harsh overhead lamp. Isadora was strapped to a metal chair, her fur matted with sweat and her head hanging low. Two men in suits stood over her, one holding a glowing interrogation device. "Step away from her," Desmond said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The men turned, reaching for their sidearms, but Gideon was faster. Two blue bolts of energy flashed through the room, catching the guards in the chest and sending them reeling back against the wall. They slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Desmond dropped his gun and ran to Isadora's side. He fumbled with the restraints, his hands shaking as he saw the jagged cuts on her arms. "Isadora, look at me. It is Desmond. I am here." She lifted her head slowly, her emerald eyes clouded with pain and exhaustion. She blinked, focusing on his face. "Desmond, you are late for the bus." He managed a weak, watery laugh as the last restraint snapped open. He caught her as she collapsed forward, pulling her small, shivering frame against his chest. "I know. I am so sorry." "We have to move," Gideon urged, keeping his eyes on the door. "The diversion won't last forever, and they will have seen the breach on the internal monitors by now." Desmond lifted Isadora into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her head resting against his shoulder. He felt a surge of protective heat that burned away his fear. He had spent his life following the rules, ensuring that everything arrived on time and in its proper place. But as he looked at the woman in his arms, he realized that some things were more important than the schedule. Isadora gripped his jacket with a weak hand. "The drive, Desmond, they didn't get it." "I know," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "We have it, and we are getting out of here." They moved back through the warehouse, the shadows stretching long and thin across the floor. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a relentless gray curtain that veiled the world. But for the first time in his life, Desmond didn't care about the weather or the delays. He had a destination, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. They reached the car just as the first searchlights began to sweep the docks behind them. Gideon slammed the vehicle into gear, and they vanished into the dark, wet streets of Vesperus Prime, three fugitives united by a truth that the corporation could never understand. Gideon steered the heavy vehicle through the labyrinthine back alleys of the Spice District, where the scent of fermented ginger and sharp vinegar masked their trail. He took a sharp turn, the tires splashing through deep puddles of oily water, and pulled into a recessed loading bay hidden behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. The engine died with a mechanical shudder, leaving them in a silence that felt heavy and fragile. Mallory was already waiting by the service door. The avian woman kept her feathers tucked tight against her frame, her dark eyes scanning the rooftops for surveillance drones. She beckoned them inside with a sharp jerk of her head. Desmond helped Isadora out of the backseat, her weight leaning heavily against his shoulder. She was pale, her green eyes clouded with pain, but she kept her grip tight on the data drive. The safe house was a cramped basement filled with the smell of old paper and ozone-free air filters. Mallory pointed to a cot in the corner. "Sit," she commanded, her voice clicking with a rhythmic, bird-like cadence. "I have medical supplies. The corporation will be searching the main arteries, but they do not know about the sub-levels of the market." Desmond stayed by Isadora's side while Mallory cleaned the wound on her shoulder. The Feli Sapiens woman winced, her tail twitching nervously against the rough fabric of the cot. Desmond took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her furred knuckles. "You are safe now," he whispered. "We are almost at the end of this." Gideon pulled a ruggedized terminal from his pack and set it on a scarred wooden table. He looked at Desmond, his expression grim. "This is a one-way trip, Desmond. You realize that, right? Once I bridge this connection and upload the contents of that drive to the Planetary Council, there is no going back. Your career is over. Your pension is gone. You will be a ghost in the system." Desmond didn't look away from Isadora. "I have spent 20 years ensuring that cargo arrived on time, Gideon. I have managed schedules for a company that views people like Isadora as inventory. I do not want that life back. The only thing I want to ensure now is that she has a future." Gideon nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips, spoken like a man who finally found something worth shipping. "Hand me the drive." Isadora reached out and placed the small metallic cylinder in Gideon's palm. Her voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "The encryption key is my mother's name. Ilara. They never thought I would use something so personal for a professional lock." The room grew quiet as Gideon began to work. The only sound was the rapid clicking of keys and the distant drip of water from a leaky pipe. On the screen, progress bars crawled forward, illuminating the room in a cold blue light. Desmond watched the data packets fly across the monitor. He saw names he recognized, high-ranking executives who had sat in boardrooms with him, now being linked to illegal deportation orders and high-gravity mining contracts that were effectively death sentences. Internal thought flickered through Desmond's mind as he realized the sheer scale of the cruelty he had been complicit in by simply being efficient. He had been a cog in a machine that ground lives into profit. He felt a cold resolve harden in his chest. He would dismantle the machine today. The terminal emitted a sharp chime. "Upload complete," Gideon announced, leaning back with a heavy sigh. "It is reaching every news outlet, every legal advocate, and the governor's private terminal. Within the hour, the Purity Initiative will be the biggest scandal in the history of Vesperus Prime." Isadora let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She leaned her head against Desmond's shoulder, her eyes closing. "They cannot hide from this," she said. They spent the next few hours watching the fallout on a small, grainy viewscreen. The news was a landslide. Images of the Iron Cradle were broadcasted across the planet. The CEO of the logistics firm was shown being led out of his office in restraints. Public outcry was immediate and fierce, with thousands of citizens taking to the streets to demand the release of the detained workers. By dawn, the Planetary Council issued an emergency stay on all deportations and a full pardon for the whistleblowers. The morning light that filtered through the basement window was thin and gray, but to Desmond, it looked like the brightest day he had ever seen. Gideon stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. "The charges are being dropped, but the company is going into receivership. You two won't find much work here anymore." "I have a plan for that," Desmond said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his handheld device. "Before we went to the Iron Cradle, I liquidated my private retirement fund. It was enough to secure passage for two on a long-haul freighter." Isadora looked up, her ears perking. "To where?" "Ethelgard," Desmond replied. "It is a forest world in the outer rim. No industrial zones, no corporate quotas, just trees and open sky. I hear they need people who know how to manage supplies and people who know how to preserve history." Isadora stood up, her movements still a bit stiff but her eyes glowing with a new light. She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I have spent my whole life in the archives, reading about worlds like that. I never thought I would see one." They met at their original bus stop one last time. The The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air crisp and smelling of damp earth. The transit station was quiet, the neon signs flickering with news of the corporate collapse. Mallory and Gideon were there to see them off. "Keep your head down until you reach the jump point," Mallory said, handing Isadora a small bag of dried fruits from her stall. "And don't forget to write. I expect a physical letter. None of this digital nonsense." Gideon shook Desmond's hand firmly. "You were a damn good manager, Desmond, but you make a much better man." The transport arrived, a sleek silver vessel designed for the long trek between stars. As the doors hissed open, Desmond felt a moment of hesitation. He looked back at the city that had been his entire world for 40 years. He saw the industrial spires and the gray clouds. Then he looked at Isadora. She was standing on the ramp, her black fur catching the morning light, her hand extended toward him. He stepped forward, leaving the routine and the safety of his old life behind. He took her hand and didn't look back. As the transport lifted off, clearing the atmosphere of Vesperis Prime, the stars began to stretch into long lines of light. They sat together in the observation lounge, the vastness of the galaxy laid out before them. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers at a bus stop. It was the quiet peace of two people who had found a home in each other. Desmond watched the distant glow of Ethelgard on the navigation screen. He knew there would be challenges ahead, and the work would be hard, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't following a schedule. He was following his heart. Isadora leaned against him, her tail resting across his lap. "We made it," she whispered. "We did," Desmond agreed, kissing her forehead. "And we are right on time." The vibration of the stellar Nomad's engines was a constant, reassuring pulse beneath the soles of Desmond's boots. He stood in the galley, watching the liquid in his cup ripple in perfect synchronization with the ship's drive. They had been in transit for 3 days, leaving the smog-choked spires of Vesperis Prime far behind. The data drive that had cost them so much was now a weapon in the hands of the Planetary Council, but the corporation's reach was long, and its memory was longer. Desmond heard the soft scuff of footfalls on the metal deck. He didn't need to turn to know it was Isadora. The air seemed to grow warmer when she was near, her presence a grounding force in the vast emptiness of space. She leaned against the counter beside him, her black fur neatly groomed, her green eyes reflecting the dim utility lights of the kitchen. "You are thinking about the landing," she said. It was not a question. She had become adept at reading the tension in his shoulders. Desmond took a slow sip of the bitter tea. "I am thinking about what comes after the landing. We are logistics experts and archive workers, Isadora. We are going to a frontier world to build something out of nothing. I want to make sure I can provide the life you deserve." Isadora reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch was soft, but her grip was firm. "You have already given me that life. You looked at me when everyone else looked through me. That is the only foundation I need." The moment was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chiming from the ship's internal comms. Desmond straightened, his instincts honed by years of managing high-pressure supply chains. That was not a standard navigational alert. It was a proximity warning. Captain Holloway's voice crackled over the speakers, tight and urgent. "Desmond, Isadora, get to the bridge. We have a situation." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. When they burst onto the bridge, the view screen was dominated by the hulking silhouette of a Kestrel-class interceptor. It was a predatory ship, sleek and painted in the matte black of corporate security. It had emerged from the shadow of a gas giant named Alindra, cutting off their vector to the Ethelgard jump point. "They found us," Isadora whispered, her tail twitching in agitation. Captain Holloway gripped the arms of his pilot's chair. "They are broadcasting a recovery signal. They claim this ship is carrying stolen proprietary hardware. They are demanding we heave to and prepare for boarding." Desmond stepped closer to the tactical display. He studied the interceptor's positioning. "They are not firing," he noted. "That means they want the drive intact, or they want us alive for questioning. They have a lock on our engines, Holloway said. If I try to burn for the jump, they will disable our thrusters before we even clear the gravity well of that moon. Desmond's mind raced. He thought of the thousands of manifests he had processed, the way cargo moved, the way systems failed and succeeded. He saw the interceptor not as a monster, but as a set of variables. "Captain, what is in our secondary hold?" Desmond asked. Holloway blinked, surprised by the shift in topic. "Industrial lubricants and emergency flares for the colony." "Why?" Desmond turned to Isadora. "You remember the archive protocols for thermal masking, the way they used to hide sensitive drives from solar flares?" Isadora's eyes widened as she caught his drift. "We use the lubricant as a carrier. If we vent it into the wake of the flares, it will create a massive, superheated cloud. To their sensors, it will look like a catastrophic reactor breach. It will blind their infrared trackers for exactly 90 seconds, Desmond added, looking at Holloway. "If we drop the cloud and immediately pivot into the moon's polar shadow, they will be shooting at a ghost." Holloway looked from the logistics manager to the archive specialist. "It is a hell of a gamble. If it doesn't work, we are sitting ducks with no coolant and no flares." "It will work," Desmond said, his voice carrying a weight of absolute certainty. "I know how their tactical AI prioritizes threats. It is programmed to follow heat signatures over visual confirmation in deep space." "Do it," Holloway commanded. The ship lurched as Isadora took the secondary station, her fingers dancing across the interface with a precision that rivaled the ship's own computer. Desmond stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, providing a silent anchor. "Releasing hold locks," Isadora announced, venting in 3, 2, 1. The stellar nomad shuddered as the contents of the secondary hold were jettisoned. A brilliant flash of white and crimson erupted behind them as the flares ignited the lubricant cloud. On the monitors, the corporate interceptor immediately adjusted its course, its nose dipping as it prepared to fire on the perceived explosion. "Hard to port," Desmond barked. Holloway slammed the thrusters. The transport ship groaned under the stress of the sudden maneuver, diving toward the dark side of Alundra. For a tense minute, the bridge was silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the crew. They watched the long-range scanners. The interceptor fired a full volley into the center of the shimmering cloud, the impact creating a secondary blossom of light that masked their true escape. "We are in the shadow," Isadora said, her voice trembling with relief. "They have lost lock." Holloway didn't waste a second. "Engaging jump drive. Hold on." The stars outside the viewscreen didn't just stretch, they snapped. The violent jerk of the fold space jump tossed Desmond back into his seat, but he didn't care. He watched the sensor ghost of the corporate ship vanish into the distance of 1,000 light years. They were silent for a long time as the ship settled into the calm of the jump. Holloway finally let out a long breath and turned his chair around. "I have been flying the frontier for 20 years, and I have never seen a logistics man pull a stunt like that. Where did you learn to fight like a tactician?" Desmond looked at Isadora, who was watching him with a look of profound warmth. "I didn't learn to fight, Captain. I learned how to protect what matters. Humans are very good at finding the most efficient path to safety when they have something to lose." Isadora stood up and walked to him, taking both of his hands in hers. Her palms were warm and her touch was steady. "You saved us, Desmond." "We saved us," he corrected. They returned to the observation lounge as the ship sped toward their new home. The tension of the chase had faded, replaced by a quiet, simmering excitement. Ethelgard appeared on the long-range scanners, a world of deep greens and vibrant blues, untouched by the gray industrialism of the inner systems. It was a place where names meant more than employee ID numbers, and where a man and a felly sapiens could walk under the sky without looking over their shoulders. Desmond looked at the data drive, then reached out and placed it in the ship's secure lockbox. Its journey was over. Theirs was just beginning. I think I am going to like being a pioneer, Desmond said, looking out at the approaching planet. Isadora leaned her head against his shoulder, her tail curling around his waist. As long as the commute is short, I think I can handle it. Desmond laughed, the sound rich and genuine. It was the laugh of a man who had finally found the one thing his logistics charts could never predict: happiness. He knew the work ahead would be grueling, and the frontier would test them in ways they couldn't imagine, but as he looked at Isadora, he knew they had everything they needed. They were no longer waiting for a bus to take them to a job they hated. They were on a journey to a life they chose. The ship began its descent, the atmosphere of Ethelgard beginning to glow around the hull. Desmond held Isadora closer, and together they watched the sunrise of a brand new world. They were home. The landing gear of the stellar nomad hissed as it bit into the soft, loam-rich soil of Ethelgard. Desmond stood at the top of the ramp, the heavy scent of crushed pine and damp earth filling his lungs. It was a sharp, clean contrast to the recycled air and chemical smog of Vesperus Prime. He stepped down, his boots sinking slightly into the mossy ground. Behind him, Isadora moved with a fluid grace that seemed even more pronounced now that she was free from the heavy coats and hiding. She leaped from the last step, her ears twitching as she took in the rustle of the golden-leaf trees surrounding the clearing. "There are no sirens here," Isadora said, her voice barely a whisper as she turned in a slow circle. "No hover buses, no corporate drones watching from the rooftops." Desmond checked the handheld scanner on his wrist. Just a lot of vegetation and a very high probability of rain in 3 hours. "My logistics training says we have a tight window to get the shelter pods deployed before the first storm hits our new home." Isadora laughed, a sound that finally lacked the jagged edge of anxiety. She grabbed one end of the heavy equipment crate near the ramp. "You and your schedules, Desmond. Some things never change." He smiled and took the other side, the weight of the cargo grounding him. "Some things should stay the same. Like me making sure you stay dry. It is a tradition at this point." They worked with a synchronized rhythm they had perfected during their flight. The modular home they had purchased with Desmond's liquidated assets was a marvel of frontier engineering. It unfolded from a compact core, hydraulic anchors biting deep into the hillside to provide a stable foundation. Desmond managed the power grid, routing the solar arrays toward the brightest patch of the sky, while Isadora organized their supplies inside. Every movement felt like a claim on their future. They weren't just moving boxes, they were building a sanctuary. By mid-afternoon, the structure was secure. Desmond stood on the small, elevated porch, looking out over the valley. Ethelgard was a world of vibrant colors, where the trees grew in spiraling patterns and the rivers ran with a clarity that seemed impossible. A single, massive moon hung pale in the daylight sky, a silent guardian over the untouched wilderness. A sharp chirp from his communicator broke the silence. It was a delayed transmission, bounced through several neutral relays to mask its origin. Desmond signaled for Isadora to join him. "It is from Gideon," he said, activating the holoprojector. The blue-tinted image of Gideon appeared in the air between them. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but he was wearing a civilian shirt instead of his corporate uniform. He was sitting in a crowded cafe, the background filled with the blurred shapes of people of a dozen different species. "If you are seeing this, you made it," Gideon said, a small smile playing on his lips. "The fallout here has been more extensive than we hoped. When the Council saw the data on the secondary servers you flagged, they didn't just stop the Purity Initiative. They dismantled the board of directors. Mallory is the lead witness in the tribunal tomorrow. She says to tell you that the Spice District is a lot quieter without the enforcers breathing down everyone's neck. The city is changing. It is slow and there is still a lot of anger, but for the first time in my career, people are looking at each other instead of just their quotas. Don't come back. Enjoy the quiet. You earned it." The message flickered and died, leaving them in the silence of the forest. Isadora leaned her head against Desmond's shoulder, her tail curling around his waist in a gesture of profound peace. "Mallory did it," she said softly. "They actually did it." "We did it too," Desmond said. He looked at his hands. They were calloused from the day's labor, stained with the soil of Ethelgard. "I spent 20 years moving cargo for a company that saw us as nothing more than variables in an equation. I thought my life was defined by the efficiency of a transit line." Isadora reached out, her furred hand interlacing with his. "You moved the most important cargo in the galaxy, Desmond. You moved a heart that had forgotten how to hope. Mine." Desmond turned to face her, the warmth of her presence more vital than the sun above them. "It wasn't just logistics, Isadora. It was the first time I ever felt like I was going towards something instead of just away from my own boredom." The rain began then. It wasn't the acidic, gray drizzle of the industrial sectors. It was a clean, heavy downpour that made the forest floor come alive with the scent of wet stone and blooming flora. They didn't retreat inside the modular home. They stood on the porch, watching the water wash away the last remnants of Vesperus Prime from their boots. Desmond looked at the woman beside him. She was no longer the shivering stranger under the transit shelter. She was a pioneer. She was his partner. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the schedule for the next day. The transit lines were gone, replaced by the winding paths of a forest that belonged to no one. "I think I will start a garden tomorrow," Isadora said, her green eyes bright as she watched the rain. "I want to grow something that isn't for a quota or a harvest report, just something beautiful." "I will help you," Desmond promised. "I am quite good at organizing rows and ensuring the irrigation is optimal." She nudged him with her shoulder, a playful glint in her eyes. "Just don't try to optimize the flowers, Desmond. Let them be a little messy. Let them grow wherever they want." He laughed, pulling her closer and feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart. "I can try to hold back my instincts, but I make no promises about the vegetable patches. Those need to be efficient." She laughed with him, the sound echoing through the clearing. They stayed there until the sun set, the single moon casting a silver glow over the valley. The stars came out, a canopy of light that belonged to no corporation and followed no board-approved map. The silence of the forest was a gift, a space they had carved out of a cold universe with nothing but a shared umbrella and the courage to say no to a life of quiet desperation. Desmond knew there would be challenges ahead. The frontier was harsh, and they were far from the comforts of the inner rim. There would be winters to survive and crops that might fail. But as he looked at Isadora, he knew that the most important logistics had already been settled. They were where they were supposed to be. They were no longer waiting for a bus to take them to a job they hated. They were exactly where they chose to be. They stepped inside their home, the door ceiling shut against the cool night air. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Desmond looked at the empty spaces waiting to be filled with their new life. He realized then that his old life hadn't been a waste. It had been the training he needed to recognize the value of what he had now. He had spent his life managing the movement of things, only to find that the only movement that mattered was the one that brought him to her. "Good night, Desmond," Isadora whispered, her eyes reflecting the soft light of their new home. "Good night, Isadora," he replied. He didn't need a transit schedule to know exactly what the morning would bring. It would bring a new world, a new garden, and a life that was entirely theirs. They were finally home.